Welcome, everyone. I'm Professor Lisa Leslie, and I want to welcome you to today's Faculty Insights event. I am delighted to be hosting this series this spring, along with my colleague, Professor Julian Yo. The theme for the Spring Faculty Insights series is current and future trends. Each week we invite one or two faculty experts to talk about an important business trend, where it has been, and to perhaps even make some bold speculations about where it may be going. I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Professor Dolly Chugh, who will be talking to us about how good people will fight bias in the future. Professor Chugh is an associate professor of management here at CERN. She's a PhD in organizational behavior from the Harvard Business School. Her research focuses on the psychology of good people, and she is the author of a best-selling popular press book, The Person You Mean to Be: How Good People Fight Bias. In terms of format, Professor Chugh is going to present for about 15 or 20 minutes. After that, I'll moderate about 10 minutes of Q&A from the audience. So while Professor Chugh is speaking, if you have questions, if you think of something, please submit those to me via the chat. I'll select a few questions to pose to Professor Chugh at the end of her talk. After the Q&A, we're going to provide some discussion questions, and you'll have some time to socialize and talk with some of your peers for about 30 minutes or so. I'll give you a little more detail about that part of the session when we get to it. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Professor Chugh. We are absolutely delighted to have you here, and we are looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the future of fighting bias.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you to the organizers for bringing us together. It's wonderful. I can see names of some students who I've had the pleasure of working with in the classroom and others who I haven't met yet. So I'm glad we're all together. We do have closed captioning on. So for those who aren't familiar with it, if you want to see the subtitles at the bottom, you can hit the CC button and adjust the settings, the font, the placement. And if you don't want to see those subtitles at the bottom, you can just hit hide subtitle. That's again, the CC button at the bottom. You click it and you can hide the subtitles if you prefer. It's just a standard practice I've been trying to use in meetings and classrooms to take advantage of being on Zoom. So I am really grateful for the chance this conversation gave me to reflect a bit and step back into this broader question of what do we see coming based on the work and research and trends we see today. As Professor Leslie mentioned, I study what I call the psychology of good people. So folks trying to do what they believe is right, which I believe is probably most of us, and yet the ways in which that we end up getting ourselves perhaps doing harm to others, perhaps not having the impact we intended, perhaps even getting into hot water. With that in mind, I've been thinking about what does that imply for what we need to be doing today to set ourselves up well as the good people of the future. I'm going to share screen and share a few thoughts on that question. So I like a little word play. So I went with literacy for all as my title today. It's obviously a spin-off of, in the United States, the With Liberty for All promise that we offer. And in many countries, there's a semblance of us trying to create a society where people can thrive, where people can grow, where people can be treated fairly. My question is, as good people, what does that look like? And I'm seeing growing importance of us moving away from purely a values-based way of thinking about these questions, where we focus on believing in a value like liberty or justice or equality or diversity, and moving towards expanding that to be necessary but not sufficient. That we also need the skills to build the kinds of teams, companies, organizations, societies, and communities where we see liberty, equality, etc. So what I wanted to focus on today is what are the skills or the literacies that we're going to require going forward to do that kind of work. So let's begin with just thinking about what's become sort of an everyday occurrence, which is every day we learn about a disparity that is either been well known for a long time or that is new and emerging. For example, we might be learning about racial disparities in medical treatment. We might be learning about gender disparities in how the economic job losses of the past year. We might be learning about disparities in the treatment of abled and disabled people in the job market. So these disparities, when we hear about something that's a difference between one group and another, puts us in a position of trying to understand what is happening so that we can address what is happening. What I'm going to offer is what I think are three important literacies, skills, to make sense of those disparities. So the first is what I'm calling psychological literacy. Psychological literacy is speaking to our ability to notice and address inequities that human beings caused and the impact it's having. So it's requiring some behavioral insight into how the human mind works. Now, this is how I see that things have evolved over time. When I started my PhD in 2001, I would say lots of people knew about something called conscious bias, or this jargony word would be explicit bias. They would talk about people having a negative stereotype of a certain group, for example. And that conscious bias was understood to be something we needed to somehow convince people to think differently or penalize people for having these negative views that were doing harm to others. Now, move forward over the last 20 some years, I was doing my PhD in the early 2000s in a lab that was focused on what's known as implicit, or often referred to as unconscious bias. And at the time when I started my PhD in 2001, nobody I talked to had any idea what I was working on, like nobody outside of my academic life. It was quite unusual to encounter somebody when they, what do you do? What do you study? Oh, I study unconscious bias, and eyes glaze over. Very hard to get any traction in explaining what that was, even though in the world of psychology, that academic research was flourishing, was very robust, and was being discussed and debated pretty intensely. If we bring it to the present, it's rare to find somebody who hasn't heard of unconscious bias, who hasn't heard of implicit bias. It's become completely sort of a part of our national conversation and our narrative, which isn't the same of saying we all understand what it is, but it's gone from being something that was never heard of and esoteric to being something that's at least known, not totally accepted, but known by a wide section of society. So we've, in our psychological literacy, gone from conscious bias to unconscious bias. And then I would say in the last year, we've gone one step further to adding systemic bias, to thinking about the headwinds and tailwinds that are kind of baked into just the way things are done around here. So if we back up to remember, we were talking about wanting to have the skills to look at a disparity and understand it. We might have originally only been able to think of it through a conscious bias lens. Women are being forced out of the workforce. Black people are being deliberately treated poorly in the medical system. And no doubt that would explain part of the disparity. But we would be missing part of the story if we didn't also understand unconscious bias and the role that might be playing. So unintended ways in which people might explicitly actually mean to be supportive, but implicitly be doing harm. And then now systemically, we're thinking about what are the ways in which we hire? What are the ways in which we deliver treatment? What is the data that's being recorded in our forms? Those are systems in place that could also be biased. Algorithms are another form of systemic bias. So the first skill, the first literacy that I think is of growing importance is that we have the ability to think about all three forms of bias and the ways in which they feed each other, creating cycles and spirals. Second form of literacy. Again, we're starting with the idea of you hear about a disparity, how do you understand it? How do you address it? The next literacy is historical literacy. This is the idea of being able to connect the dots in the data we're looking at about the present disparity to be able to see where that came from. So for example, if you see differences in health outcomes, or if you see differences in housing patterns today, a historical way of understanding that would be to simply assume that people have opted in to those circumstances, that there wasn't any sort of unconscious, conscious, or systemic force that led them into it. But what we do know from some really cool emerging research from Thea Salter and colleagues is that there's actually tremendous influence in our minds, in our ability to see bias in the present as a function of our knowledge of historical events. So Salter and colleagues call this the Marley hypothesis. This is a pop culture reference to Bob Marley's song Buffalo Soldier. And the lyrics of that song, I promise you, academic papers rarely have such interesting pop culture references, but this particular one built off this premise of the lyric that if you know your history, then you would know where you were coming from. You wouldn't have to ask me, who the heck do I think I am? And that, I think, is really important to us thinking about disparities. So, for example, I've written about my surprise, I'm going to confess my ignorance about United States history, despite the fact I took many years of United States history as a student in the American public school system, that I didn't know that after World War II, the GI Bill, which was the legislation that supported veterans of World War II in the American military to have a low interest or no interest loan to help buy a home and free college tuition upon returning from World War II. So we saw this huge spike in home ownership and college attendance. And I grew up hearing about the GI Bill and thinking that's what led to this big spike in home ownership and the rise of the American suburb. What I didn't know is that the way this legislation was designed, it essentially excluded Black veterans. It led to this spike in home ownership and college attendance for white veterans, but not Black veterans. So in fact, if you look at the present and you see, this isn't the only reason, it's multi-causal, but you see these big gaps in home ownership between Black families and white families, and college attendance between Black families and white families. Part of the explanation sits in a really important historical set of facts, which many of us don't know about. It turns out, when I realized I was ignorant about this, I started asking lots of people. When I would give talks to educators, I would ask educators, and a stunningly high percent of even educators and in general, people who've had American history classes don't know this. So again, we see a system in place, systemic bias in how we've learned our history that's obscuring some facts that would inform how we look at a disparity in the present. Again, what we're trying to do is build the skills and literacy to be able to understand a disparity so that we can address the disparity. So the Marley hypothesis says we need to understand more about the past so we can understand more about the present. So the literacy there is historical literacy, building enough knowledge, connecting the dots between today, yesterday, and the future. One interesting body of research I've been looking at, I'm still learning about this, is the idea of continuous thinking versus discontinuous thinking when we look at the past. And so the idea here is, do we see events as related? For example, do I see what I just described to you as about the GI Bill as related to housing disparities in the present, or unrelated in a discontinuous mindset? I would see those as two separate events. In continuous mindset, I would see them as having some causal influence. And some of the research I've been looking at from other scholars suggests that when there's something good in the past, we tend to have a more continuous thinking mindset about it. And when there's something bad in the past, we tend to have a discontinuous thinking. We just sort of assume that bad thing isn't going to affect what's happening in the present. So you can see how if we have that asymmetry in how we view the past and what dots connect to what, we end up having a very disparate understanding of what we're looking at in current day disparities. So part of our historical literacy is applying that continuous thinking to both the good and the bad. And finally, the third literacy I want to offer before we open this up to be more of a conversation is the idea of developmental literacy, the ability that we can see ourselves as people who can learn, unlearn, and relearn things, or as we've heard about, I think, in many domains, the idea of a growth mindset. Carol Dweck's research that we have a belief in terms of whether or not our skills are malleable, whether our public speaking skills could be improved with practice, whether our math skills could be improved by looking at our mistakes. And in this area of becoming more able to create diverse, inclusive, and unbiased teams, communities, families, organizations, developmentally, we would want to have a growth mindset where we see ourselves as works in progress, where if I make a mistake, if I say a word that's inappropriate, if I make an assumption about somebody that is erroneous, that I can take that mistake and milk it for some learnings and do better next time. Developmentally, that's not often how we've thought about these issues. I've written a lot about that we tend to have a good person mindset, the psychology of good people that I refer to, where we're free of bias or mistakes, and we're just supposed to know how to do that. We're supposed to know, despite it being a very rapidly changing world, we're supposed to somehow have all this figured out, as opposed to being what I've been calling a goodish person, that growth mindset. We're always learning and getting better. And that means taking ownership for our own learning. So in summary, I'll wrap up by saying that I think in the past, we've had an psychological, an historical, and developmental approach to thinking about how to be a good person, how to be a less biased person, on how to build less biased teams and organizations. And that going forward, we're going to want to move towards having more of a psychologically literate, historically literate, and developmentally literate approach to these issues. In other words, we're going to want to not just rely on our values, but build the skills to support them. I'll stop there, and I think those are the questions we're sending into the breakout rooms with, and I will look for Lisa to join me in conversation. Hey.
Hey. Thanks so much, Dolly. It was very interesting and provocative, and I love this. This literacies framing is super, super interesting and helpful. I think one question that came up is, in thinking about these literacies that are skills, what would your advice be around translating these into behaviors? Right? What are things that we as can do concretely as people, for example, to move from this more discontinuous to continuous way of thinking, for example, about bad events?
Yeah, that's something I've been actually really, I'm working on my next book right now, and I'm trying to think really concretely about that. I mean, there's two pieces of it. There's what should we do, actually do to build the skills and apply the skills, but there's also the how do we do it? And I'm playing a lot with the how do we do it, which is some of the stuff is kind of threatening, self-threatening to the identities we care about. So we care about this good person identity. And then, I was walking in Central Park recently, and as some of our listeners may know, Central Park used to be a thriving village of Black Americans that was basically torn down in order to build Central Park. That's really hard information for me to get my heart and head around when you're sort of enjoying the park, but then you understand the cost, the destruction, the harm, the wrongness that led to it. So what I've been interested in is, so I need to get the continuous thinking there. But in order for my mind to do that, to go into the bad stuff and connect it to the present, the bad stuff in the past and connect it to the present, I need to bolster myself to be able to take on the shame or the rage or the disbelief that can't be true. That they couldn't have just forced people to leave and taken everything they had. And so I've been looking at some of the research around. One of the things is it's called values affirmation, where the idea of, can we, before we go into the effort, if you're about to, let's say, read the plaque about what I just described in Central Park, or you're about to read an article, that just doing a short mental exercise, just a few seconds, reminding yourself of the values you care about. So in this case, it might be, I care deeply about a more equal society. That's something that's deeply important to me. And then that kind of gives us some mental resilience to go into like, this is going to be awful what I'm about to learn. The other thing we can do is start using that analysis in terms of like, once we can sort of get ourselves to do that unlearning and learning, to actually use it to implement solutions that make sense. So if the problem we're trying to solve is, let's say, the gender disparity and job loss, if we make an assumption that I guess women are just leaving because they don't want to work anymore, I guess that's what's going on, or I guess they just can't handle it, our solution is going to be very different than if we understand sort of psychologically, historically, what's led to the job losses of the past year. So we're going to come up with more creative and more useful solutions in that setting.
Yeah, that's great. So another question is a question from Haley that just came up, and I was wondering this too, is that, I love the way you talk about goodish people, and this, comes up with your literacy around having a growth mindset, right? And this developmental literacy is that, we need to recognize that we're all flawed as human beings, and we're going to make mistakes, and people with the best of intentions when it comes to diversity and inclusion are going to mess up and make other people uncomfortable and do things wrong. And I think that, there's some people that don't try because they don't care, but there are some people that don't try because they're scared, particularly in, today's kind of political climate, and there's fear of being canceled for messing up, right? And all this kind of stuff. And so what advice do you have around that for people who feel that they want to do more and they want to try and they know they're not going to be perfect, but you can make a case there's a legitimate fear, right, about what the repercussions might be of messing up, even if it's well-intentioned.
Absolutely. And I feel that too. I mean, even though I sort of intellectually am in this space, like as a human being, I absolutely feel that more and more as in recent months and years. Well, there's a couple of things. So one is that what we know from the research on apologies is that when people are really penalized and canceled, it's when they double down on their mistake, or when they ignore feedback from others that a mistake has been made. When people apologize with sincerity, and a real apology is not, Lisa, I'm sorry if you were offended. That's me putting it on Lisa, not on myself. A real apology is, I am sorry I messed up. I'm sorry, I should have done better. And then I go figure out how to fix it or how to learn more. And then I do better the next time. Those are situations where those apologies actually tend to have more traction and viewed as more sincere. So the first thing is to realize it isn't that people are necessarily being canceled because they messed up. It's often they're being canceled because of how they responded to the mess up. So that's a big thing about being goodish is learning how to apologize and do it well.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. And that's something that I think comes up in my leadership class as well, is that like, it's a very easy thing, like just generally, whether it's about bias or not, learning to apologize. Like that's not our first gut instinct, right? We want to be defensive, but it's so powerful.
Yes. It's so hard. And I mean, and it's like, embedded in that is you're admitting you're wrong, and that sucks too.
Yeah, that's great advice. Something else I've just been wondering, it's interesting hearing you talk about, and I love your kind of trajectory around the psychological literacy, how we've gone from unconscious bias to talking about, conscious to unconscious, right, to systemic. And one thing I'm always wondering about, and I think I have some insight on, is like what are we missing? What's the thing that, 5 years from now we're going to be talking about that? Because, systemic bias has been there in the academic literature, like since the 70s. It just hasn't been in the published conscious. Like, what are we missing? Like, what are the groups that we're not including? What what do you think 5 years from now we're going to be saying to ourselves, like, wow, I can't believe we were thinking about this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it ties somewhat to intersectionality. I think that's another concept. It's being discussed a lot right now. So it's not that it isn't in the national conversation, but somehow, because we are so category driven in how we talk, like if we were talking about disparities, it would be like a graph about race disparities or a graph about gender disparities, as opposed to sort of the intersections of those two identity dimensions. I have to confess, I myself kind of stumble in this space. So I think there's some breakthrough coming where maybe it's practice, or maybe there's a different mental model, or there's something that will make it more fluid for us to think about people as opposed to as categories.
Yeah, that's a great insight too. When I think about it a lot, is the intersection of race and social class, right?
Yeah.
That underlies so many phenomena, and it's so rare for people to try to really break it down, right? It's like, what's going on here? That's an interesting point.
That's a good one. Yeah.
So I have one very specific question for you here from Amal, but I want to broaden it out to a broader question, which we'll end on.
Okay.
And so I'll tell you the very specific question first, is just kind of how and why, did it come to be that Black veterans were left out of this GI Bill? But to spin that out, I'm just really curious, how did you learn about that? And so I want to spin that out. And I've been listening a lot to the Ezra Klein show recently, which is a podcast. And he always asks for book recommendations at the end.
Oh.
So that's how I'm going to end here, is ask you, how did you learn about that one piece specifically and how it happened? And then spin out to, for people who really want to develop their historical literacy, can you give us some recommendations? Well, what should we go out and read? What were some insightful sources for you?
My last newsletter was just about reading, actually. I just, on Sunday, put out, it's on my website, dollychugh.com, if anybody wants to see it. But it was about the value of reading more and how to do it when we're all feeling so overwhelmed. And I don't know, I don't have the attention span, it seems, these days. So how to deal with that. So how did I learn about the GI Bill? I was working on my first book, and I was just sort of in some rabbit hole on the internet, and I stumbled upon it. And I don't remember where on the internet I was, but I remember stumbling upon it. And I actually remember literally where I was, like where I was working that day when I stumbled upon it. And I was like, this can't be true. Like, the internet, like this is going to be one of those flat earth things. It just can't be true. So I started, like, just to prove that it wasn't true, started looking things up, and it's very easy to prove to yourself that it's true. It is so well documented. So it's just wasn't in the sort of, the main sources of learning that I had growing up. And it is also possible I missed it, but that was my first assumption, was that I have a bad memory, or I was probably too obsessed with playing sports in high school and kind of spaced out in AP history. But then when I started talking to others, I realized that this is widespread. Many people don't know this. And then I started realizing Ta-Nehisi Coates has written about this, like others have written about this gap in our knowledge. To answer the specific question of how that could be, my understanding is this was part of the federal, in the United States, the federal versus state domain of how the GI Bill was implemented. And basically many states insisted on having control over the specific criteria that would qualify a veteran. And one of the reasons they did that is because they wanted to control the racial distribution of these rights. So it isn't that there are zero veterans, but in my book, I have the statistics. It's some ridiculously small percentage of Black veterans. In terms of what to read, there's so many good books. If you haven't read The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, she's in the press a lot for Caste, her most recent book, which is also wonderful. But I really think The Warmth of Other Suns is a revelation and just a fascinating page turner. It's an oral history. I'm so bad at this. Off the top of my head, See No Stranger by Valerie Kaur is very powerful. The Memo by Minda Harts, another very powerful book. The New Jim Crow. Ta-Nehisi Coates' work. If you want to look at fiction, at Homegoing is excellent. I'm just reading books that happen to be behind me. But if you look at my Goodreads account, which is public, you can see what I'm reading, and I think reading is a really powerful way to kind of to kind of let ourselves, both through nonfiction and fiction, kind of build those literacies that I'm talking about. The newsletter I put out yesterday, that I just put the link in the chat, suggests some ways to go about that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dolly. This wraps up our Q&A portion. Thanks so much for being with us on behalf of everyone and providing such an interesting and provocative talk. We really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone who joined. The end of the semester is tough, so appreciate everyone's attention. Okay.
All right, so we're going to shift now to the discussion portion. So the discussion questions have been shared in the chat. You're going to have some breakout invitations. Please feel free to go ahead and accept those. They'll last for about 30 minutes. And then I hope we'll see you all back here next week for our final Faculty Insights event. We'll be having Professor Amy Webb, who will be talking about the future of strategic forecasting. Thanks so much, everybody.